All right, everyone. Now, time for part two involving involving hero identities. More specifically, we're going to be talking about secret identities and why exactly some things work better than others, and some of the reasons why they won't work. So, it said if you're going to be a metahuman, a hero, villain, whatever, you do need to possibly need to conceal your identity as much as possible. This is because one, if you're a hero, people always just say, "Oh, we need you to do this or else." And same thing for the villains. Pretty much once they know someone is capable of doing something, they could be hounding you at, you know, all hours of the day and night. And even if it is a good either call, it said good kind of job, sometimes you will need the time to rest said, or in this case, if you actually have to visit people, that you care about very far away, that's one thing. Like I said, because some characters really don't have any family, I said, that they would care about. So it's like, yeah, you can't really threaten me, on any personal level because, everyone always has someone out there, but you never know what's going to actually, was said, how things might actually work. And someone may not actually put two and two together unless they're actively stalking you and try to have it. It's kind of like the idea of saying that you know um, that the reason why some character might have had it is because uh, it said they were actually it said a daughter was raised by a single mother who basically kept her maiden name along with um, with her daughter. It said, but the daughter did get married, and it said and changed her name because maybe in this case the name was something, a bit more specific. And it said a bit more specific, and then it's like she literally married someone with last name Johnson. So that's one thing. You don't want to basically, be having coffee, with your, close relatives, and then all of a sudden you look out the window and you see various threats arrive. It'd probably be a lot more of a danger for actual, I said, for essentially heroes rather than villains because chances are once a villain is actually known, they may say if you see this person, do not approach or anything. But the problem is that they could still find ways of disguising themselves. So the fact that they could move around a little bit and just go anywhere, but once you know, villains find out where heroes are, they will definitely, cause as much problem as possible. And but then again, once certain loved ones are definitely have been attacked, this is actually could push heroes over the edge, and could basically would show someone may not be as in control as they would think it is. Now, if you were basically reveal someone who was an anti-hero, a lot of people are going to say, "Yeah, I'm not touching that." Instead, until after everything is done, and said, "Yes, we treated this." So we treated all the injured parties accordingly, um, and everything is fine. But it's best to let them get out their set out their angst. I mean, because even the best version of Wolverine will definitely carve you up and said like a Christmas turkey, if you really threaten everything to the dangerous parts. And another possible issue, actually, with not with that basically being a little too public, with certain secret identity, it said if you are a hero, is there some people will try to actually backtrack, to where you actually became a certain type of hero. So in theory, say like in Static Shock, there was the Big Bang. So okay, here's the gas that caused everything. It said so in theory, anyone could just walk in, get a dose of it, and they would get their powers. And they actually had two episodes that kind of worked on that. One time involved a guy basically stealing a few vials of it. It said in its liquid state, and while he did technically breathe it in, it you didn't really see like a gaseous fumes. It was just like a quick little sniff. It wasn't. it was like it was just basically purple liquid at the time, and it kind of it turned him into a bit of an asymmetrical kind of freak. Um, and it said that didn't really seem to work, and yet he was actually prior to that he was actually going to think about drinking it. I mean, I'm not entirely sure about what kind of you say what kind of what the dangers are of breathing something in and not being able to actually get it out. I mean, I know that you can definitely smell something very spicy, on its own, but drinking it could be up there. Kind of like how someone can drink like really potent moonshine that's like the true stuff, you know, and it's like they just take a whiff and it's like, oh, that's way too much for me. But if they were to drink, like basically just knock it back, not knowing what the concentration was, then you could definitely be in trouble very quickly. And I do know of a brand of legal moonshine that you actually don't taste the alcohol experience, and it's just like that was 100 proof, right? And it's like, wow. And in this case, that one did kind of have a weird taste, like it was trying to imitate alcohol, but it it was just okay. But a lot of the other flavors they had is like would not actually believe this was. So the idea is the fact that someone can say, well, they did it, why can't I? Because there was actually an episode of Family Guy where they showed the Griffins getting superpowers, from a truck that basically crashed in their yard, and they got superpowers from that. And Adam West basically decided he would fight fire with fire and go to the toxic waste dump and basically get powers of his own. But he ended up getting a whole bunch of it's a non-canon cancer from that. It was like, yeah, it said that could have just been a total freak accident. Maybe you got something very different. So it wasn't the same thing. But definitely said, and one definite issue involving heroes with limited secret identities is how narcissistic they are. And I definitely would say someone like Superman is definitely a total narcissist because a lot of animated versions of him will actually show the fact that he stands up very straight, very poised. He said he has the same kind of black hair. It said black hair that he normally does, and he's also pretty ripped. He's not like trying to be this weakling that turns into Superman. Kind of like the idea of when they showed like how Thor shared his body with a man named Donald Blake, or the He-Man transformation. It was just the fact that it's like, this is a job for Superman, and he just takes off his glasses. And there was a bit of a glare on the thing, but there really wasn't that much. Wouldn't be that much of a difference, especially if you knew a person, altogether. So it's just like, yeah, I'm just gonna remove my glasses. It's gonna be a trope. It's like it said, yeah, but what if there's a superhero actually has a total bullshit filter? Say kind of like Mr. Furious from Mystery Men. In this case, he was actually able to see that it said that billionaire Lance guy that was actually Captain Amazing, and he was also not impressed by the Sphinx's um, philosophical stuff. It was like it's like, okay, yes, it does sound good, but just like, dude, he's just kind of flipping the words. It's like if you would ask him, what's and so what color is the sky? You know, the sky is, the sky is whatever color you think it is. And say rather than just saying, oh, it said, I think it's a very nice blue today, or to say, a simple one-word answer, because that's not going to really work. And even that stupid spit curl that essentially Superman had, like, what exactly is that supposed to be? I mean, that's just kind of stupid. And you're risking way too much. It's just like, how does no one ever see this thing? Ever see this to not see past the mask? And even in this case, someone like Batman, while he does wear a mask, he does have a pretty broad chin. he would have to kind of cover that up a lot more because, it's kind of going, well, let's see. Batman seems to have an unlimited supply of gadgets. He pretty much has, seems like he has a lot of freedom on his time. And that jaw looks oddly familiar because when they actually had the animated series, The Batman, Barbara Gordon actually figured out who he was, you know, in some kind of way, because he said like muscles on his muscles, a lot of money, and a jaw I would know anywhere was there. But even in this case, I think that was the episode he had bit of amnesia, so he didn't know he was the Batman. But in like the next series, he actually brings Batgirl to the thing, and he just basically just takes off his cowl like it was no big deal, and he does. But in return, he actually exposes her identity to Robin just because. But even though she actually guessed it, because it's like, okay, let's instead when you finally have that little bit of everything, the young Ward, and he suddenly gets a sidekick. Uh, that's a little hard, not to ignore. So, not saying that there said heroes cannot have, their faces out in the open. Someone like the Fantastic Four, that kind of works. And if you're talking about, the movie from the early 2000s, they pretty much they didn't have they said they weren't wearing their costumes at the time. They just kind of, jumped into the fray, and there really wasn't any way to go back on it. And I know someone like, John Stewart as the Green Lantern. He just pretty much kind of embraced everything. He just kind of embraced everything as it was, and they even showed like his landlady knowing he was that thing because when Kilowog showed up, said, "What are you doing in Mr. Stewart's clothes?" Because not so. But the question is, if you don't see how everyone else kind of keeps their identities, thing, it's like, what exactly, anyone could probably, hunt them down in some kind of capacity. I mean, unless you're overpowered, like maybe like Aquaman, who at least says, "Yes, you can find me," but he said at the bottom of the ocean. But how are you going to get there? And by that time, he said they know you're coming and you're going to get it. But I definitely also would say something interesting would be the difference when you see anime characters. You see the actual eyes behind them rather than just the whites of their eyes. Because I know characters like Batman, the Flash, Green Arrow, Speedy. Um, they said they kind of had that, and when they showed like Deadpool and Wolverine in the new movie, they also had those awkward kind of white out eyes, and you know that's definitely interesting. But when you kind of see past the actually see their real eyes, it's kind of strange because in Justice League Unlimited, the Huntress actually started out with just white out eyes, but then when she was basically let go from the Justice League, you actually saw, her eyes behind that, and certain versions of Batgirl will just kind of show the eyes behind it rather than just being, the same kind of white out area on that one. And you just never know what something is going to be. And I definitely would say that she definitely does need the whited out issues. If she is a variation where she's a natural redhead, because a red hair is very hard to kind of hide naturally. It's just like it's not as prominent in the population, so it's like, I wonder who this is. So I said I'm gauging. She's roughly about this height, this kind of weight. She doesn't really sound like she's very old, so we're just eventually someone will be able to pick up on who she might be. Same thing kind of with like black hair. You know, growing up as a kid, I only really knew someone who was actually, Caucasian with white hair, with yeah, black hair. It was just like, that's something that you really wouldn't be able to do much about unless you wear a wig or somehow you can go Super Saiyan. Some variation of Super Saiyan, so it's like, yes, the hair and eyes are a slightly different color, so maybe someone won't immediately associate everything um, with a certain type of hero, but the more you cover your face, the better. In this case, when they had the DC character Vigilante, he just kind of had the traditional, bandana over everything, and that would definitely would work. But you know, he said sometimes he said if they could just basically kind of like take like a two photographs and mix it together, that would be one thing. Kind of like, and even then, even if you basically only cover up, the top part of your face, you kind of need to make sure it kind of comes down because um, when they had the Speed Racer movie, you could definitely tell that was Matthew Fox in the actual, thing because he just kind of had it like where you would have like sunglasses, but if there was a little bit more underneath and across the nose, like this, kind of like, then some people may not really understand that, and you could kind of hide a little bit with the nose because, um, everyone's noses can be a little bit different, and in some movies when they use a fake nose, it's kind of hard to recognize someone. Kind of like when Nicole Kidman portrayed Virginia Woolf and she had that prosthetic nose on. Um, I didn't actually recognize who that actually was because, her nose normally is said a lot smaller on this thing, and Virginia Woolf's was actually pretty big. So, let's say if you're trying to basically seem like you're trying to hide your nose for some reason, that's definitely important. Same thing with like, if you have like the Harrison Ford, scar across your chin, someone's gonna notice that. So you're gonna need to cover everything else up. So, and sometimes you could use, a full-fledged mask, for something, kind of like how Iron Man has his heads-up display. It's like that's just what he does, and if he's going to be traveling that fast, he's got to make sure he has his oxygen supply and everything else. But the more you can definitely cover up, the more um, it's definitely up there because you don't really want, you definitely do want your privacy. I definitely would say that. In terms of like wearing masks, you may have the mask that kind of sticks right on your face, like the Incredibles or um, various other DC characters like Nightwing or another, I said Hal Jordan, stuff like that. That would definitely be um, interesting to actually have, even if you're an alien. It's like, yeah, you're not really gonna fool anyone, but but you kind of want to make sure that it definitely looks like it would stick on your face very well and it's not gonna just suddenly kind of pop off because when they did like the spirit Gabriel Mott guy from Suits, that yes, the spirit gum definitely does help, but the actual mask didn't really look like it was. There really wasn't that much on there, but he had the advantage of pretty much everyone thinking the real guy was actually dead. But but sometimes you never know what kind of superpowers you might actually get. And maybe that could actually help you to kind of transform a little bit more. And one character that comes to mind is Freakazoid, in which the fact that he did wear glasses in his normal thing, and the face is still technically, the same, but the fact that he does have blue skin can be a little bit different with the fact that, who he is. And, if you were basically, projected as being slightly taller, um, let's say slightly taller, than everything, and definitely a lot more, a totally different personality. That would definitely be it would definitely be very interesting. Very similar to like the DC character, the Creeper, who doesn't wear a mask, but it's kind of hard to look past his awkward grin, yellow skin, and green hair. He said, and also the very flamboyant kind of costume. To think he was actually just an original reporter, but you never know what, you might have. And sometimes you may have like the blacked out eyes behind a mask could also be, might actually have something different because you don't want to, have something that actually conforms to all your face, in my opinion. Because when they showed someone like Mr. Miracle, um, also from DC, it it kind of wore something that imitated his face, but you actually saw, the eyes behind it. And if it wasn't for the fact that he lived in a totally different, part of the universe, someone he wouldn't really have much of a secret identity, overall. For me, I mean, you could still have that, on its own, but a whited out eyes and maybe something around it, like a it's like kind of raccoon eyes might actually be there, but you could also just have it, just come down to the nose and then maybe kind of cover things up a little bit, kind of like what Christian Bale wore as Batman, albeit much brighter colors. And you just never know instead what kind of things would do because you don't want to have like a very tiny, barely existent mask like Jim Carrey as the Riddler. That was just way too thin, but not everyone can walk around in full like Thor gear like Natalie Portman can. I mean, it just seems like, when you just, fought there, it's like, Jane? It's like it didn't really seem to, affect him as much. And, you know, you do want to definitely protect your identities as much as possible. And if you're going to be wearing, even if a character somehow wears glasses and then switches to goggles, that's one option. You could change the color of the goggles to maybe hide the color of your eyes a little bit, but you also, want to make sure that your secret identity is very far away from who the actual hero is going to be. And this is actually why I think Michael B. Jordan can never actually be a black Superman. If just like just saying, okay, here's a black Kal-El. Like, no, he has to be someone different because he essentially would have to be turned into Steve Urkel every time. And even then, it's like, and even then, it's just like he just has way too much of a cool factor at the best of times. So, yes, he would show off his, things, but just like, I said, they would notice, him a little too much. Maybe make him someone like a version of Steel, which would probably be pretty good, or just make him someone, different. Like he is definitely someone that would hide, such a thing. It's like in theory, someone that looks, very attractive, on their own, doesn't matter what gender they are. It's like, you look like you would have everything you would ever want. It said, no way you would be the guy running around. It said trying to become a hero, at all waking hours. And even then, I definitely would say that characters that reveal their identities, uh, they really have to plan a lot for it. Kind of like Ozymandias from The Watchmen. Like, yeah, he was filthy, stinking rich. He was definitely, able to anticipate everything because of his high intelligence. So it wouldn't be so just basically just trying to take him down in a world where there was only one confirmed true super being would not exactly be an easy thing to do at the best of times. Just kind of like you don't want to just reveal yourself. It's like, come and get me, like having all the targets, because what's to actually stop someone from just dropping a nuke right over, the headquarters and erasing everything? That's not going to really do much of anything. You don't want to basically put that threat on. It's kind of like we know when Iron Man says, Tony Stark said, "I am Iron Man," rather than just convincing him it was a bodyguard in a suit, like he did actually in the comics. He said, and even in Ultimate Avengers, where it was actually kind of trashing a bunch of other things, but it was like, wow, Stark, that's what I should have known. It's just like you don't. He said you want to basically be, keep everything separate because with like someone like Spider-Man, he was basically in worse shape when he actually did instead of he ever kept everything in under wraps. And even when they show like in Spider-Man 2, it's like he's just some kid. That's one thing, but it was only a handful of people that even knew about it. Is it was just like, okay, yeah, this is what happened. It was just like, yeah, he's just a normal guy like us. He doesn't have to be someone constantly in the spotlight. Because, kind of like with, what happened in No Way Home, he pretty much had to get rid of everyone that ever, cared about him. And it just kind of seems kind of strange that even in that movie, it was like, you know, like he couldn't have just walked into everything and said, "Oh, hey, Peter." Like they wouldn't just call him Pete, but it's just like, okay, yes, if everyone was just, Like if every like so many people knew him beforehand, like that Ned character, and it seems like MJ actually had said some knowledge of his existence. It was like, okay, yeah, like it's just like no one knew I revealed my identity. That doesn't mean Peter Parker does not actually still exist. So if everything is kind of kept, under wraps, that's definitely important because people panic way too much. You know, kind of like what happened within Men in Black. Like if they knew aliens were around them, they never know what might actually happen. It said even if they're the best, aliens in the universe, if they look like horrible monsters, it's not going to be anything. Look what happened with the monsters. They could be the nicest people you ever met, but yes, you're dealing with a Frankenstein, said werewolf, said and two vampires at a moment's notice. Likely drive. It said likely either driving that weird car that Herman had or riding on the back of Spot. It was just like, okay. And then even like the family reunion, they showed like the creature from the Black Lagoon. It said I know there was it said and another werewolf, but it's just like, yeah, people are way too afraid. And even then, sometimes there can be things unavoided. To say maybe things unavoided where someone does learn it, but you just never know what they're going to actually do about the issue. Because kind of like in like in No Way Home, like Flash Thompson make it seem as though like, oh yes, we were best friends, and we're just like, come on, man, you're making me look bad. And I'm like, why couldn't there actually been a version of Venom that just bit his head off? It's like, way too many sycophants, out there. Kind of like in Batman Begins, where it's like, yeah, everyone's here to celebrate, his birthday, but it's just like, who exactly are these people? He hasn't been back um, in this thing. It's kind of, did he actually send out the invitations personally? Because at very best, he may would have just sent, for, some of the some of the board members and employees and Rachel. But it's just like, yeah, I heard there was like, I said, yeah, I said, here's my plus 100. Just like they're just trying to get the taste of the good life. They don't actually see Bruce Wayne as a good person. They just know he's got a lot of money, and yeah. So that's kind of that actually would be a problem if they do say learn that you are actually rich. It's like, well, it said Batman's the richest out of all of us, so he should pay for most of it. And it said, but they always make it seem as though that Green Arrow is also pretty wealthy. I know that essentially some of the contributions that Mr. Terrific had definitely also put him in some pretty good finances as well. So it's just like, well, we have to split this up. So it's so we need the all important watchtower with the following things. So you could say, yes, Batman does pay for the watchtower, but like the dormitories, the food, auxiliary weapons, the staff, said that would have to be taken care of said by the others. Because it doesn't matter because you know money will definitely ruin a lot of things. Because you don't want to just be. He said, I know. It said people always would say, oh, you shouldn't be greedy about a couple of things in life, by having all this money and all this other stuff. But I'm thinking, well, one, I'm not that. It said I'm not that affluent, and two, after having money, it said not having money for so long, what exactly you know said and you finally get it, what exactly said do you want to actually do with it? 'Cause it's kind of like the idea would say having someone in like it says school and auto loans, and you're so worried about paying it off, but when you finally do, it's like if you're still working at the same job that you used to pay for everything, you've been there a little while, you've gotten a bit of a raise, but then you realize, hey, I'm not paying for these things anymore, and it just kind of builds up. I mean, I actually paid my auto loan off right as the pandemic hit, and I got a lot of scholarships in school. So it's like the money I would have needed, just kind it says, is just kind of there. And the question is like, well, how much do I actually need, for to actually get by with? So you realize, hey, I have a lot more, budget for, for a couple of things that you can afford. You can still, you kind of want to have it. But then again, half the time, if I really want something special, I just go donate platelets and let the rewards points accumulate enough time so I can put it towards something a little bit bigger. Uh, And just the fact that yes, I do want something, but I know how to get it. I do have a job, and say, but certain things I just don't have to pay for due to some weird circumstances I'm not going to get into. So but as soon as people know you have, all the money, there's so much more money, they will definitely try to, get things from you. I mean, not saying that it isn't a bad thing. It's like for other heroes to kind of help each other. It's be kind of like saying, it's like, hey, Spider-Man, I know that you said you probably got a scholarship, to the town, but we saw your apartment's a little, not exactly in an ideal location, you know, or in this case, you might want to get, we know a play, we can actually, float you a couple money, it's a bit of money for things, for that. It'd be almost kind of like saying, if this is a reality where Tony Stark is already knows who he is, it's like, hey, there's a couple of, paying photography gigs for you. This is what we can do, and we can basically just make sure that everything has been taken care of. I mean, nowadays, you have like DoorDash. It's like, they can make it so the fact is like, yes, this person paid for the groceries, but it's going there. And this actually kind of makes a problem with actually not having much of a secret identity a problem because there's so many facial recognition cameras everywhere. They can basically track you at even the basic of things. And people always want to snap photos, make a big, Facebook or Twitter post, saying, "Oh, look how everything is." And some people just don't want to actually be, seen. And just like the fact that you get way too many clear photos of a superhero, they might be able to start to piece certain things out there. Because if you were to see someone who's covered the half part of their face and they cover the top part, they might actually be able to kind of piece it together. And they actually did that on an episode of the original CSI, where they show this guy wearing thick aviator glasses. They basically just kind of reflected his face and then took away the sunglasses. And it's like, does this look like anyone? It'd be almost like actually making a virtual police sketch or one of those Mii's that Nintendo has. So, so in theory, that would be kind of hard. So you want to make sure you do keep everything under wraps because I mean, even if it's a so if you're talking about creating a retro superhero in villains, that's perfectly fine. But if you try to make them a little too much in the modern day and era, you're going to have to start covering up a lot more. I mean, even when at the end of the series, Batman Beyond, Bruce Wayne actually wore the suit that he eventually gave to Terry McGinnis, but it seems like it did cover up enough of his face, and he really couldn't see, wouldn't know who he was, you know. And even if someone, because there are always like so many kind of safeguards to prevent someone from seeing past it, and no one would believe that a man that old would still be running around like that. But it's kind of like the show Person of Interest. It's like government spying on you in every waking moment. And even though the machine in that one was good, wouldn't take much for someone to try to track someone down. A lot of things exist on the dark web. You know that no one really wants to find. It said people only want to find if they can, and it just doesn't mean anything. Instead, they could always use it. I mean, even kind of like in the last Terminator movie, the Terminator was actually just able to process everything just by logging into the internet. It's the fact that there always got to be a trace for someone. So if you're a total nobody, that's one thing, but you want to make sure that you still have a backup plan, which kind of reminds me of Rorschach in the Watchmen movie, where you did actually see him earlier in the movie, but the idea is the fact that it was almost like that was his mask and his actual Rorschach um, face mask, which I think was actually pretty was super impressive. Was actually his real face. So that's definitely one thing you want to make sure you can do, but it's also kind of like, you know, you don't want to be tracked, by anything because in the animated series of the Batman, Bruce Wayne was actually saying the fact that it's like these are normally the sound disturbances in the app. It said linked to jets, but this is in Metropolis, which said where Superman is, and they frequent two places. It said this apartment complex and the Daily Planet, and it's just like, it wouldn't take much for anyone to actually realize, wait a second. And so we just kind of put this together. Okay, here's a list of tenants. Okay, there's only two people that actually work at the Daily Planet that live in here, and the other one's a woman. You know, and you say yes, you would have to do it, but it's like, if no one, is in range of Superman's hearing, all they would just have to do is show up, special delivery, kryptonite, bullet to the head, and that's it. It's just like if you're going to basically be popping in and out of places, make sure that no one can really track you. Kind of like in the Wonka movie. I mean, until he basically had that piece of fabric get caught on the manhole, he could have been going on for much longer than I said much longer than you know he said with everything. Like in terms, if they didn't just open their store, they were just elsewhere. Like it said just out of the reach of the chocolate cartel. It's one thing, but if you can't basically vanish very quickly, he said, and reappear, that's one thing. I mean, sure, Spider-Man transforms into a dark alleyway. And said, he said, which isn't too bad, but the question is, you know, who's going to put in the next security camera? Who's going to awkwardly, emerge? Because in Spider-Man, No Way Home, someone actually stole his backpack. So it's just like, what would happen if he saw someone right there, you know, and it wasn't Stanley. For me, I think Stanley would be able to do the Jedi mind trick, and it's like you didn't see anything, like okay, but you never know who's going to notice, this stuff. And the question is, you know, what exactly are you going to do about even something like disguising your voice, because Batman's voice is always so different, when he does that. And you want to, and a lot of people do have some pretty serious vocal ranges, like Frank Welker, who does the voice of Scooby Doo and Fred. They don't sound anything alike, but yet he was actually able to sound like Megatron and Cave of Wonders. That was something. And in this case, in Dragon Ball, like it said, it said one guy does the voices for Yamcha, Piccolo, and Vegeta, and they sound nothing alike. So you want to make sure you have something like that, because if you're from a different country, it said that's one thing, but he could also would say is the fact that you could possibly double say could definitely do both, no problem. So if everyone you do an American accent in England, as part of your superhero persona, they may not think, you're a Brit like us, because they were thinking, well, it takes quite a bit of effort to sound like someone else, you know, to definitely use it, because even when it's kind of like how some people can definitely talk very differently in a foreign language. But I actually saw this video where this guy, just kind of talks so plainly, like he's not, trying to. He's basically just using a regular American accent, but here is actually is, and sometimes it really just isn't, you know, everything. But you don't want to just be someone who is constantly trying to make jokes, in a foreign language, because like I know that a lot of Brits, have like a bunch of weird words they throw in, and it just loses you, and it just sounds like a bunch of mess. And I know that Welsh people also have a very different language as a whole. and they have that unnecessarily long like town name, and I'm thinking, okay, that would definitely be pretty helpful, to disguise everything, but just like, what exactly, you want to make sure, they can understand, that people can definitely understand you in threats, and it's like, yes, I can yell, do everything like that. Um, I know that Ben Affleck's Batman, did have that natural vocal, instead vocal distorter, but I'm thinking that might actually do something. So the fact that someone records him, he doesn't really sound the same, and that's perfectly fine with me. I mean, if someone actually could almost do, is pretty good at impressions, like someone like Mel Blanc, that would be pretty good. Um, but you definitely want to make sure you can choose a word. You said choose a way of talking that is definitely very different than what you would have. I mean, in comparison, for Dragon Ball, I would definitely would love to sound like Yamcha, and definitely would definitely want to see someone when he does fully power up. He's a lot more like that of Piccolo, because Vegeta still kind of sounds like he doesn't want to be there for anything. Like even the most happiest of moments, it's like, yeah. I mean, Piccolo is at least someone who you could just stare at him and vaguely get the message of everything. So, and even I'm trying to find it kind of weird that when they switched, vocals of Iron Man, they kind of vaguely disguised his voice, earlier in the movie, but it was just like, it definitely needs to sound very different. Heck, even in Ultimate Avengers, it just had kind of had a bit of a metallic kind of thing, but you could definitely tell who it was underneath it. Just kind of like how you definitely knew it was James Spader doing the voice of Ultron because he didn't have the traditional metallic, filter. And if you really want to talk about, definitely someone different, at least with something like look at Tom Hardy when he did, just like most of his other movies, like Eddie Brock or what he was in Inception. Yeah, but when he had that big Bane muzzle, it definitely really did distort his voice, and it sounded like he was not the regular American person. He was raised elsewhere. He developed the accent, and that was it. So, because I definitely would say is that you want, but then again, if you're in a certain area, like the deep south, some accents may kind of blend together, but it seems like once you start crossing certain areas, like as soon as you start getting to like, as soon as you go to like to the Midwest, it's not exactly going to be, it's definitely going to be very different. So that may even actually limit where you actually can go. I mean, you don't have to actually be someone that goes around to everything. I mean, what's wrong with just being a small, not so much a small town hero, but it's an area kind of like that of Reno, where it's like I said, the biggest small town, in and thing, and you don't need something so cosmically overpowered like being in New York or Chicago. You just know the fact that okay, yes, these are very we have, this is how much the actual I said how much land the city limits are, and this is how much everything surrounds it in there until everything is else there. Kind of like would say, yes, I do operate in Chicago, but I actually do actually operate in like Aurora, instead from Wayne's World, or Calumet City, which was mentioned in the Silence of the Lambs. Like you definitely do know that there are plenty of things in the suburbs that do need your attention, and you rarely, and while you do need to go into the city for things, if there's more than one hero out there, that's all you need to do. But one idea I always kind of had for a thing would be what is called exchange heroes, kind of like not so much like perfect strangers, like in the fact that they're trying to get rid of things, but it's like you know you're a minority in one area, but you would fit, but you don't live that way. It's kind of like the idea would say. Um, kind of like living in like you're an Asian American, but you don't but you're not in Chinatown, so you're not in Chinatown, or let's say it's where no one would believe you're the same kind of thing. But you also may have someone that might be in Chinatown that's maybe Hispanic or Caucasian, or at least lives close enough to it, I would say. and maybe there's something else, kind of like how you would have like in New York you have like regular Harlem and Spanish Harlem. So all they just simply do is the fact that through some weird interdimensional connector, um, it's an interdimensional connector, they can actually operate in those areas, and no one will be the wiser for so long. Because in this case, instead of traveling, so many miles across everything, if they're not very powerful heroes, it's just like you just open the door and that's it. Kind of like what happened in the Adjustment Bureau. You just kind of open the door and that's it. But before we go, I definitely would need to say is that it definitely is kind of nice, like if you do get the chance to definitely dress up like a hero or a villain, to express yourself from time to time. But you got to but if this in real life, said in real life, anyone could always see past everything. Okay, you definitely know, going into various, movies as a very young kid. You know, Clark Kent is Superman, Bruce Wayne is, Batman, and the fact that no one else kind of puts two and two together is just awkward. I definitely would say because one thing I could also would say, like even in like there's various anime series, some characters can hide in plain sight. Like look at all the stuff that Team Rocket was able to do, and like with Sailor Moon, like they literally just may put on a bit of makeup instead of in the jewelry, but they really were, looked like they were just doing cosplay. Unlike the live action version, where most of them basically put on wigs and definitely got a lot prettier. Sailor Jupiter got the biggest makeover because she looked so plain, but yet, once she transformed, she was all made up, and until someone kind of transforms right in front of you. So it's like the. But I think the reason why we can do that is we actually need, so because there are real heroes in our lives every day, and we need to respect them. You know, it said whether it said they're on the job or taking a break, just be happy that we have them in our lives to make the world a better place. So the next video I'll make would actually be talking about kind of what you would say definitely would be about so would be more about why I think certain so the ideas of female heroes are a little bit kind of a strange thing. Not for anything bad, just the fact that they often ride they're just female versions of their original rather than being something else. And then maybe other concepts that people throw in to be a bit more woke. So hope you guys have a good one, and I'll see us in the future.